Hi, and welcome to our experience, the ASCP podcast. My name's Chad Wers. I'm the Chief Executive for ASCP, always paired with my tag team partner, Tom Hansel of Hansel Health. And today we're talking to someone from the FDA, and we're very excited about this. This is someone that helped us maybe a little less than a year ago on one of our Apex presentations and provided some insight from her role at the Food and Drug Administration. And her name is Helen Edelberg. She is a physician. She's a master's of public health, and probably most important to us, she's a geriatrician. And as I was speaking with her prior to the show starting, we take those opportunities to know people that understand what we're doing every day in geriatric medicine, whether it's in pharmacy or whether it's in physician practice or nurse practice, very seriously, because sometimes we have to over-explain ourselves and what we do and who we represent to people that work on the government side and the different agencies. So we're thrilled, Helen, to have you here. You are the Deputy Director, Safety, Office of New Drugs at CDER/FDA. CDER is the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. I got that out.
Right.
But welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. Yes, I mean, I am first and foremost a geriatrician and internist, and I'm delighted to be here.
Awesome. Well, tell us a little bit, give us a little bit of your background, where you've been, what brought you to the FDA, and a little bit about what your role is now.
Sure. So I was in academic geriatric medicine for a number of years, taking care of patients, doing research, teaching. And after finishing my MPH in health policy and management, I decided that I wanted to go into the pharmaceutical industry, really because I was tired of asking my patients to, start low, go slow, cut their pills in half. There was nothing in the drug labels themselves that explained how the drugs should be used in older adults. So after a decade spent working in global regulatory affairs, so overseeing the development and approval and post-approval regulatory strategy for drugs, focused on that area, I came to the realization that much of what we know about the safety of new drugs in older adults is learned after the drug has been approved. And I transitioned to the field of global pharmacovigilance, or patient safety and risk management. And there I worked again, as I had been in geriatrics, in a cross-functional, multidisciplinary way to better understand the safety profile of drugs across the product life cycle. Several years ago, I was given the opportunity to lead what's called the New Drugs Regulatory Program Post-Market Safety Workstream at FDA, and to join Office of New Drugs as the first Deputy Office Director for Safety. This is, as you mentioned, within the Center for Drug Evaluation Research. Here we are focusing our talented workforce and our limited resources on modernizing our post-market safety framework, how we look at drugs following approval and ensure that they are safe for the public.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And it is from our small sector of healthcare and what our members do, it is critical to have some insight into that. I mean, we've all either arrived in long-term care as clinicians or sought out long-term care kind of for the same reasons. We recognize that we have a exploding population of individuals. They are increasingly exposed to medications, multiple medications, and we've chosen that this is an area where we feel like we can provide some clinical help and some patient care help to make sure that people are getting what they need out of their medications in a safe way. It's interesting to hear how FDA is approaching that, and it's certainly thrilling that somebody like you is in that position, because you don't think about that all the time. We think about impact of drugs on, what is happening with our patients, but you don't think about the side of it that is, well, how do we inform the clinicians about the drugs, and how do we do it in a modern way that, maybe 20 years ago we were dealing with a subset of the population that was not as impactful and as large as the subset that we are dealing with, starting a few years ago for the next couple decades. So talk a little bit about that approach that the FDA is taking. And Yeah,
I mean, it was really not until the 1980s, and it's been which to me doesn't sound very long ago, but the FDA began initiatives to increase the quantity and quality of information about the use of drugs in geriatric patients. And FDA defines geriatric patients as those over the age of 65, so that healthcare providers would have enough information for the safe and effective use of drugs in this population. So, for example, we encourage a thorough evaluation of the safety and effectiveness of drugs in older adults and recommend that we look at age-related differences in effectiveness, in dose response, and safety. And starting in 1998, we required or recommended that drug companies present effectiveness and safety data based on age in their applications. Come 2012, the International Conference on Harmonization Guidance came out, and the FDA reaffirmed the importance of obtaining data on the full age range of the geriatric population, right? So not just 65 to 70, but across the age spectrum, which is really critical, especially in a long-term care setting where many of the residents are well over the age of 80. And this is because of the likelihood of comorbidities and, of course, as you mentioned, the increasing number of older adults in the U.S. In 2013, the FDA published the FDA plan to enhance the collection and availability of demographic subgroup data. And this is critical also for understanding drugs in older adults. So this was related to the completeness and quality of demographic subgroup data collection, reporting, analysis, as well as identifying barriers to subgroup enrollment in clinical trials and employing strategies to encourage greater participation, including participation of geriatric patients, and to make subgroup data more available and transparent. And this is important for older adults who are in nursing homes as well as those in the community. Since then, we've published drug trial snapshots, which are available online, about approved novel drugs. And these give us information on the baseline demographics of the key trials that support approval, as well as information on the number and percentage of geriatric patients in the trials, subgroup safety and effectiveness of the drugs in older compared to younger adults. More recently, in November of 2020, we published a guidance for industry enhancing the diversity of clinical trial populations. And, you know, we often think of diversity based on ethnicity and race and location of residency and sex, but just as important as age range and looking at underrepresented populations in clinical trials, as well as non-demographic factors such as patients with organ dysfunction, patients with comorbidities, disabilities, those at the extreme range of weight, and populations with diseases or conditions that have low prevalence or rare diseases. So this guidance describes broadening our eligibility criteria in clinical trials, developing drugs in a way such that the trials reflect the population most likely to use the drug, which in many cases is a population of older adults, and applying the recommendations for broadening eligibility criteria for trials of drugs intended to treat rare diseases or conditions.
Awesome.
You know, Helen, I'm so glad to hear that kind of extensive trials. You know, we were at a point not that long ago where 10,000 people a day were turning 65. Now we're getting to the point where 10,000 people a day are turning 85. And so that's great to hear that, you know, people are living longer and that's, you know, mostly due to the medications to help them fight certain diseases. And I can imagine that those trials now were never really thought about on that 80 plus population. I mean, our own president is 80 years old, and so this is going to become more and more prevalent, and I'm sure we're going to hit that same stats at 90 and 95. But knowing that one of the, I guess, crises or potential crises we're facing in America is the population boom for seniors, and most of them are going to be rural. They're going to want to age in place. They're going to be at home. They may, or I'm sure they all have internet access of some sort, but they may or may not even know where to go or where to get that information. So they rely on their pharmacist or their prescriber, their doctor, their practitioner to inform them. And so I can imagine that you guys feel a pretty big responsibility to get the word out. And even though internet and software and that kind of stuff has made it probably more possible, we're having a situation where we're having maybe a shortage in primary care physicians. We've have some shortages we've experienced in pharmacists as well, shortages in nurses. And so there's shortages of the people that are going to be actually in the field being able to communicate this kind of stuff. So how does the FDA, I guess, get the word out? How do you communicate? How do you educate? I know that could be available on a website, but I can't imagine these physicians, as I see them click through one patient every 15 minutes, even have time to do the research. So is there things that you guys are doing or able to do to communicate and help educate doctors and pharmacists in a different way than maybe you did 10 years ago?
Yeah, I would say that first and foremost, the way that we communicate information about products is through labeling. And if we're talking about a paucity of geriatricians and geriatric pharmacists, right? It's really about how do we get that information on our patient populations into the labeling. Having worked in industry, promotional material, I understand full well how that is regulated. Promotional materials need to be based on labeling. Mm-hmm. So that's really where we make the difference in terms of ensuring that information on our populations are there. We can communicate that information through the web, through podcasts, through presentations, which are all available on the FDA website. But really, it wasn't until the late 1990s that we even had geriatric information in the labeling. And that was with the geriatric use subsection that was created. Now we have information that can at least tell us if there's information that's sufficient to detect a difference between older and younger adults, it's provided in that section. Now, we do have a more recent guidance in September 2020, a draft guidance, which once it's finalized will represent the thinking of the FDA, geriatric information in human prescription drug and biological product labeling. And this information will help drug companies to better understand the appropriate placement and content of the geriatric information in that prescribing information. And the goal then is to provide clear recommendations to help ensure that appropriate information on the use of prescription drugs is consistently placed in the proper sections, that it's clear and accessible to healthcare practitioners. So this is, when we've asked healthcare practitioners drug companies that when they revise the existing information, that they look at their labeling content, that they really think about whether it accurately reflects the current knowledge in their older patients for all of the approved indications. It's important, too, that information from post-market controlled clinical studies and well-documented clinical trials, information from literature search, pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic studies conducted in older adults, and adverse event reports that are received related to geriatric patient population are also included there and captured in the label. So it's really about making sure that the information we provide and oversee is captured and then appropriately shared with the public.
So, Helen, I have to believe part of the reason that you are in your role at FDA is because of the complexity that's really occurred over a 50 to 60 year time frame. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, we had 500 or 600 drugs on the U.S. market. Now we have thousands of drugs, and they are endlessly complex. They could be for a specific gene type that an individual has. They could be for a specific age group, as we've seen in the past. How does the FDA, when you look out in the future and think about safety and efficacy, how is the FDA evolving with this level of complexity? Because, everything you've talked about today, it makes perfect sense, but it just seems daunting because of how much we've got out there. So how do you look forward and look at safety and efficacy in the future based on this sort of evolving toward this complexity?
Yeah, I'm delighted you brought that up. On April 15th, FDA Center for Drug and Evaluation and Research actually launched the CDER Center for Clinical Trial Innovation, or C3TI, which it's called. The mission of this group is to promote CDER clinical trial innovation activities through enhanced communication and collaboration internally within CDER and externally. And for years, CDER has championed innovation, and this is one of the reasons that we have such complexity in drug development. And our activities to foster and support innovation span drug development programs, therapeutic areas, and disciplines. These efforts have led to improvement in the design and conduct of clinical trials that are intended to efficiently generate evidence on the safety and effectiveness of new therapies in ways that meet the growing demand of drug development. So the goals of this particular program are to help those involved with research, to help stay current with clinical trial innovations, to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of clinical trials for all age groups, including for older adults, to help increase the participation of diverse populations, which is particularly relevant. And by diverse populations, I think it's important that we consider where people are living as well as how old they are.
Absolutely.
Because and believe me, we do discuss this, and in turn accelerate the development of safe and effective drugs.
I'm glad you brought that up, because we've been talking, very recently and about that particular aspect. Pharmacists that work in older adult settings are always trying to find ways to make somebody's medication profile safer and more effective. And we've always talked about drug interactions, and we've talked about this drug might be superior to this drug based on the individual, but we also have to add that setting component into it. Yeah. There may be a drug that is better for somebody because they live at home alone versus live in an assisted living center or a nursing facility where they have support and nurses that are working with them. And that's a different aspect of this that we have to be prepared for as this population continues to boom forward. I'm going to ask you a question. We've been talking a lot about manufacturers and research and the data coming in to FDA and then the FDA pushing it out in the label. What is your role? And there may not be the role, so feel free to say that's not really our area, but what about the role of the data that's on the label and helping the clinician give it to people, the patient? Like that aspect of it. Is the label built in a way that then in turn helps the clinician better educate the patient? Or maybe that's the whole point, but that's my anomaly question. Sorry. The other thing is it reminds me back to my bench days when I was a pharmacist in a pharmacy, and you had the package insert label, but it's not built in a way that you could hand it to the patient. So you would build patient information from that label. And I just didn't know if there was any guidance the FDA tried to give pharmacists, even prescribers, on how to boil all of that complex information down that's important enough to be on the label and make sense to a clinician to then better inform patients.
So in response to that question, there are certain circumstances, patient labeling, including FDA-approved patient labeling, like medication guides and consumer medication information provided by third parties that is not reviewed by FDA and drug companies, has been duplicative. Sometimes it's incomplete or conflicting or difficult to read and understand, and has not been sufficient to meet the needs of patients. So in May of 2023, FDA proposed a new rule entitled Patient Medication Information. And according to this proposed patient medication information rule, FDA is proposing to require drug companies to create a new type of labeling for patients or their caregivers for prescription drugs used, dispensed, or administered as on an outpatient basis, which of course nursing homes are considered
mix of, but yeah.
Some mix of outpatient and inpatient, to provide patients or their caregivers with clear, concise, accessible, and useful written prescription drug information delivered in a consistent and easily understood format to help patients use their prescription drugs safely and effectively. And this patient medication information would be a one-page document, so certainly much easier than anything we have now, that would have a standardized format and content written in non-technical language that would be submitted to FDA for approval by the applicant. So the proposed PMI rule would require that the subheading warnings would be followed by a concise summary of serious warnings. That summary would include information found in the drug's boxed warning section if they have one, including any that might lead, of course, to serious death or injury. And in the prescribing information, any information that's relevant for the patient to know for the safe and effective use of that drug. So authorized dispensers would be required to provide this PMI to patients or caregivers each time a prescription drug for which an FDA-approved PMI exists is used, dispensed, or administered on an outpatient basis. And so I'm really glad you brought that up, because it really is, pretty new information, and I think very exciting.
No, that is very exciting. And again, we look out 5 years from today, and 57 million people are over the age of 65. It's going to be 74 million in 2030. And a lot of individuals that may have sought out assisted living and nursing home settings or needed those settings, there's not going to be enough of those to support everybody. More people are going to be living at home. More people desire, let's be honest, to live at home. Nobody says, I can't wait till I get to the nursing home. So those kinds of pieces become critical, because you have people at home with dangerous drugs. They have to have resources so that they take them correctly. You have your engagements with your clinicians, but there has to be something else that just reinforces, how do I take this? Or if I forgot what the pharmacist said, or the physician said, or the nurse practitioner said, here's a resource. I can look at this, and there's enough information there that I can be safe. So, no, thank you for answering. That's a critical point.
I think it's critical too, because I don't take a lot of medications, but I can't tell you the last time I actually been asked from a pharmacist, would you like to be counseled this medication? It's usually sign here, and they cover themselves, but I understand, because the pharmacist is covered up. They've got more work than they can handle, and they literally in most settings don't have the time to actually counsel. And so I can see many these elderly patients driving away, not even really getting that pharmacist counsel, and having a resource like this would be critical.
Yeah, that's the nightmare scenario that we hear sometimes, is that people have been discharged from the hospital, or they got a new drug and went to the pharmacy to pick it up, and they really had no idea what they were receiving, whether that they were getting an inhaler and didn't know it was an inhaler, whether it was something that was just an oral tablet, but no instruction regarding the important features of what they needed to pay attention to taking that new product.
Or they go home with the different version of the same drug they have at home, and decide that, I'm supposed to take both of them.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
That was always my example was, you came home on quinapril and you had all these bottles of lisinopril, and do you take both of those, or are they the same? They rhyme. Does that mean they're the same? Like, people don't know that stuff. Yeah. So no, that's a great point.
Even very well-educated people, it really,
100%.
Yeah.
So as far as pharmacists, what your recommendation for pharmacists to do to get more information? Is there a place that FDA offers that they can go and be able to dive in a little deeper?
There is a wealth of information on the FDA website. Certainly any guidances I've mentioned are available by just looking for the guidance searches, but there are also prescribing information resources. And interestingly, in 2020, FDA presented on what was called Bridging the Gap, Promoting Safe and Effective Drug Use in Geriatric Patients. And that presentation explicitly discusses inclusion of geriatric patients in clinical studies as appropriate, improving communication about the use of prescription drugs in older patients. And the presentation, as well as the video, are both available on the FDA website.
Awesome.
Well, Helen, any last messages you want to send out to your colleagues that work in geriatrics out there from your position and role at the FDA?
Well, I have to say it's it's a pleasure to be in the role that I'm in. And every time I meet someone with a background in geriatrics, and there are a few of us floating around the FDA, it's like a little club that we're here. We're here not just thinking broadly about the American public that we serve, but certainly with a special eye to the older population.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for what you do. We feel like you're part of our club, and now that you're at the FDA and you have your internal FDA club, we feel like we have better access, and we have somebody that's sort of paying attention to the people that we take care of from that side. So we really appreciate that. And we
I can
appreciate
promise you it's a lot
on.
more than me, and it's a lot more than just the few geriatrics people. We're all working hard for the public good.
Right. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Helen.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right. We'll see
Thank
everybody
you.
next time on Our Experience.